Welcome to Naked Reflections, brought to you from the Woolf Institute. I'm Ed Kessler, and each week I'll be taking an in-depth look at the stories reported by our friends over at The Naked Scientists. What does the latest scientific stuff mean for the rest of us? Stay with us and find out. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means so many different things. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, that's all. Translation is our subject this week. Getting it right is crucial to diplomacy, theology, and literature, to name just three, but it's not easy. Now we have computers and AI to help us, of course, but do they? Here's Colin Johnson on the Naked Scientist show, Artificial Intelligence in Medicine.
They're very good at translation, but they're very bad at converting language into something that we might think of as understanding, particularly visual understanding. Can a crocodile run a steeplechase? That's a piece of language. We immediately convert that into an image of a crocodile trying to jump over large hurdles, and we know that that's not possible. But for a current AI system, it doesn't have that capacity for visualization.
My guests this week are Dr. Esther Miriam Wagner. She is Executive Director of the Woolf Institute and Fellow of St Edmund's College, Cambridge. Miriam is an expert in Yiddish translation, as well as the meaning of pre-modern Hebrew and Arabic. And Professor Duncan Large, Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia. Duncan has taught in Paris, Dublin and Oxford, and is a specialist in German studies. Plenty of translation needed in all of those areas, if you ask me. Duncan, I have to ask, how well do you think Google would translate Shakespeare?
I suspect you're asking this question because I gave my inaugural lecture with the title, Could Google Translate Shakespeare? I've been doing some work in recent years on the question of how computers can help literary translators. As you said in your introduction, we're very used by now to computers helping us out when we need translation, but usually that's not literary examples. Literary translators have felt until now, I would say, that they can effectively resist the rise of the machines. It's been the assumption that literary translation is just too complex for machines to do well. I took Shakespeare as an example of a quite demanding literary text. It's pretty much the most demanding kind of ask you could make of a computer these days to translate something that's that old, that is poetry. The short answer to the question is no. Google can't really translate Shakespeare. That's where you have to start nuancing it because, yes, of course, Google can translate Shakespeare. It can come up with something which is perhaps quite passable, depending on which bit of Shakespeare you choose. I think the thing about literary translation is that passable usually at least isn't enough. And with translation, it's so often a question of, well, is the translation good enough? And in practical circumstances, of course, when you've got a very tight deadline and you're commissioning a translation, then you have to have expectations accordingly. With literary translation, as readers, we tend to be much more demanding simply. If I'd got Google to translate this play, would I, expect an audience to pay money to go and hear actors speaking those words? So Shakespeare is almost too much of an ask, certainly of computers at the moment. But that said, computers have made huge strides in recent years, and the models of machine translation have developed so that for some kinds of literature, machine translation can do a pretty good job these days. And, that has knock-on effects for those of us in education, for example, when students might be using machine translation to do exercises which until now would have been standard exercises for modern languages teaching, for example.
It sounds like the answer is yes, but ... Miriam, tell us about the particular problems raised by translating Hebrew and Arabic into English, and I suppose vice versa as well.
There are two different problems that come with the two sets of languages. So I'll start with Arabic. Arabic is a highly symbolic language, which means that words do not necessarily convey just one meaning, but they can say the whole set of meanings. Like in Latin, fortuna. Fortuna means both bad luck and good luck. And that's something that Arabic has as well. You have this vast amount of meaning that can be contained in one word. So you get it all from the context. All these different words that could mean all sorts of things. Sometimes you really have to really concentrate to understand what some ancient Arabic texts are saying. And with Hebrew, the problems are slightly different, because in Hebrew, the punctuation is done in a different way. We punctuate when we write, but in Hebrew, the punctuation is expressed by the word end. So when people translate from Hebrew into English, very often they just translated all the ends, which led to this development of a biblical register, which you say, and God created this, and God did this. And it's quite funny because you have this biblical register then reapplied for other languages, even though the end isn't used as a punctuation device. So the biblical translation mistake basically filters into many other registers of languages.
Perhaps once it's done that, though, it ceases to be a mistake. I think that's a really interesting question, kind of how translations take on lives of their own, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, for example, in Yiddish, Yiddish is one of those examples where people in the synagogues would sit and they would translate the Hebrew text word by word. Rather than we have a whole sentence and then we translate the sentence. They would do it word by word, which created this very, very awkward sort of mix between Yiddish and Hebrew that was sort of used in the synagogue. And that led to the emergence of real code switching between the two languages. That's why very often Jewish languages have this extreme amount of Hebrew vocabulary being used, because it's facilitated by this very, very bizarre translation techniques that the young men would employ in the synagogues.
What is code switching, Miriam?
So code switching is when people use two different kinds of languages in the same sentence. It's an example you often use, Ed, when you say, oh, I had all these Torahs, right? Torahs is Torah. It's a Hebrew word originally that is then used by Jewish speakers in English. You basically code switch between two languages. And then at some point, when enough people understand it, it becomes a loan word and everyone understands it.
Yes, if I could perhaps come in on the point that Miriam made earlier, that kind of very close translation of the Hebrew, it still goes on to this day, doesn't it? I mean, there are new translations of Old Testament books which are still coming out, which are extremely close and which are aiming deliberately to produce a kind of mashup of perhaps, the example I'm thinking of is the Shocken Bible and that kind of mashup of English with Hebrew syntax. It's an amazing language, and one can certainly see why the translator would have that aim, even if it's a tough read.
Duncan, you mentioned how some translations become almost revered. And the one that came straight to my mind was the King James Bible. It's almost become holy in its own right. Is that what you were thinking about, or are there other examples as well?
I think that's the preeminent example in English, yes. And we're not far away, are we, from the celebration of the 400th anniversary of the first publication of the King James. So there's been a lot of interest in that particular translation in recent years, certainly in the last decade. It's funny, I once wrote to Desert Island Discs asking which Bible translation they are offering the castaways, because they always say, oh, you can have the Bible and Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, one assumes, collected works, but the Bible, I didn't get a very satisfactory answer, I must say, to my question, but I've always assumed it's the King James Version. I don't think I've heard quite a lot of episodes of that program. I don't think anyone has ever specified a particular translation. But when we say in English, oh, that sounds biblical or something, that's what we mean, isn't it? Usually. I think it's still the case that people think of that as the go-to Bible translation, certainly as far as, coming back to your question, as far as its influence on later literature is concerned. I mean, it's had, there's no other Bible translation in English that has had anything like the impact, not least, of course, because the King James has been going for 400 years and it's contemporary with Shakespeare. And it's not coincidental that it's contemporary with Shakespeare, because I think there's an interesting argument about how it reflects the development of the English language at that stage in the same way that Shakespeare does, and this huge flourishing of English language and literature in that early 17th century period.
I have to share with you both one of my favorite exam questions in this area, which is that all translation is interpretation. Now, we have two experts in front of me, so I can't resist but asking you whether you think the answer is yes, no, or maybe. Miriam?
Yes. I think the most extreme example, perhaps, that I know about doesn't really come from the area I work in, but German philosophers. So Immanuel Kant, I know that experts on Kant, they don't want to read him in German because he's so difficult to grasp. So even Germans will prefer to read him in English because at least there has always been sort of one interpretation sort of shoehorned on this multitude of meanings that he brings forward. So I think I would definitely answer yes.
I'm certainly not going to disagree. It's a resounding yes from me as well. I would perhaps come at this issue from a slightly different angle. I think it's so important to think of translators as first and foremost readers. If you start from that point, then of course it's self-evident that any translation which is produced on the basis of a translator's reading of a text is going to be an interpretation, because every reading is an interpretation. So when you think about it, I think it seems a no-brainer in a way, but there's such a lot being invested in precisely in that question. And I think there are clearly those who want to resist the answer yes. But what is at stake if you do that? There's been a long tradition of arguments around untranslatability, for example, and they very often hinge on this question. Oh, well, all translations are interpretations. Therefore, in some sense, no translation captures the essence of the original. It's but a short step to kind of fetishizing the original and reaching the conclusion that no translation is ever going to be perfect. So what do? Do you stop translating? And what do you mean by perfect anyway? And it's that notion of a perfect translation that's out there, that kind of Platonic translation, which nobody can get to, so everything is lost in translation. I don't think that really helps us to evaluate really what is going on in translation. You have to recognize that a translated book is a different book. It's written by the translator. It's not Tolstoy, it's written by Constance Garnett or whatever. There are just the original or the source text and the translation are two different things. And I think the interpretative side to translation is to be celebrated. Quite simply, I think so often, particularly those who don't really have so much to do with translation, perhaps think of something getting lost in translation. What about what gets gained? The lost in translation idea has become a kind of a way of approaching translation, thinking about what can't be translated, what gets lost. But so often translations are hugely inventive, and they're wonderful examples of how writers can overcome constraints, because that's what translation is. It's a form of constrained writing. And, the human ingenuity that goes into translating in the light of those constraints is really mind-boggling.
So, Miriam, are you a lost in translation person or are you a gained in translation person?
I'm definitely a gained in translation person.
Give us an example, Miriam, from your own work. I'm thinking of some of the pre-modern letters you touched on earlier. Quite different texts than works of literature that Duncan's been referring to. Are there particular challenges there in understanding what the author meant?
It touches upon this sort of core issue of translation. How close do you keep to the original, or how far can you remove yourself just keeping the sense? But that's something I always really struggle with, because I translate a lot of original documents, and I'm one of those people. I like to keep as close as possible to the original structure. It enables the reader in the new language to capture a little bit of the essence of the original. And I always get smacked down for this. Whenever I want to publish an edition of something, people say, oh, no, this is much too literal. Make it flow better, make it into better English. And I always try to resist.
This is Naked Reflections, and my guests this week are Miriam Wagner and Duncan Large. We're discussing the complexities of translation, but I can confirm that no interpreters have been involved in the making of this podcast. When it comes to science, translation is not just a question of language. A layperson could not make head or tail of the data that comes from a radio telescope, for example. We need experts to interpret it. The breakthrough in the discovery of the double helix came because of a similar act of interpretation, as Megan McGregor explained in the Naked Scientist show, Rosalind Franklin, The Hidden Story of DNA.
Rosalind Franklin used X-ray crystallography to create Photo 51, a black and white picture showing an X shape made up of spaced apart black splotches, and it was thanks to this photograph that the structure of DNA as a helix was figured out. This was a picture of crystallized DNA.
Duncan, do you work on the translation of science texts in your centre?
We don't. We are a centre for literary translation, but that said, we do interpret the notion of literature quite broadly. Certainly in my own work on the translation of philosophical texts, I'm interested in non-fiction examples. So not just kind of literary translation in its narrow belletristic sense. And thinking beyond that, with a broader conception of literature, then that includes philosophy, as I mentioned, history, and other kinds of essayistic writing. I'm working on a paper at the moment, for example, for a conference in the autumn, which looks at the translation of Vienna Circle philosophy, so logical positivism. It's kind of a challenge for me because usually I'm working with continental philosophers, particularly Nietzsche. And so translating a philosopher like Nietzsche is, not very far from translating a novel or a set of dialogues. And he uses those forms. He writes poetry and so on. I'm interested personally in exploring a different kind of philosophy, which is precisely more scientific, because I think the assumption is that if you're translating a book of logic, then there's not very much leeway for a translator, and there shouldn't be. The examples that I've been giving so far are high literary examples, shall we say, where what is at stake is not so obviously a notion of a true original, an original which encapsulates some kind of truth, which must be preserved in the translation. Of course, novels incorporate truths as well, but they're of a different kind. So I'm interested in looking at a very technical kind of philosophy and translations of it to see basically what kind of variations have been produced in English translations of German philosophy of this kind. What's interesting me, at least in these initial stages, is how much English language philosophers have been dealing with Vienna Circle philosophy in the original German. And in a way, that's, if you like, the other side of the coin to the argument about untranslatability. If there is a precious truth there, which you don't want to go astray in the translation process, then perhaps you do just need to read the original language. That's something, one of the texts I teach on my module in the history of theory of translation from Schopenhauer in the mid-19th century. That's basically his view about philosophy translation. You're much better off reading the original language and learning the original language in order to be able to, decipher the philosophy. You could take the approach of somebody like Heidegger, for example, who again takes a very philological view of ancient Greek philosophy there and argues that, in a sense, the philosophy is already in the language. So how can you possibly do justice to the philosophy in translation? He has a different argument, which is that kind of German manages to achieve something similar, so that's okay then. I mean, these are questions leading us into different areas, and particularly scriptural areas.
So picking up on that, Miriam, as a German speaker, I mean, how well do you think English translators cope with some of your favorite German authors?
I think I have to go straight into German humor here. The oxymoron of German humor. Germans have a different sense of humor, pronouncedly different from the English, but I think it's also very, very difficult to translate. So one of my favorite authors in German is Daniel Kehlmann, who wrote a book called Measuring the World. And in German, that book had me doubled over. It's absolutely hilarious. It's this very laconic way of writing something. And the humor isn't really accessible through sort of the language sentence. It's just the way he expresses things. And I wanted to share that book with English friends, and I went to the bookshop and I picked up a copy and looked in, and I couldn't detect the humor at all. It was just not there. And it was so heartbreaking to see that basically, even though they probably employed a very, very professional person, they just couldn't translate it. They just couldn't translate it into English, and it was just lost.
Yes, I suppose the main problem with translating humor is that the point of a joke is to make the person hearing the joke laugh. And so it's all about the end. So if you're translating the means to the end and the end isn't achieved, then you failed. And it's one of those areas actually in translation where it is more possible than in many others to say, well, this is a successful translation or not, because you're thinking about the purpose of the translation. It's a bit like advertising. I wouldn't be tempted to say, oh, well, therefore humor is untranslatable. I think, in these cases, one just needs to take a more creative approach to the translation process. I think, in a way, one needs, therefore, to kind of reorientate one's approach to translation and be less interested in how the translation reflects the original text and think more about the effect that it's going to have on your audience hearing your joke in translation or whatever. Perhaps a joke in translation is going to be a kind of parallel joke, if you like, where if you translated it back into the original language, you wouldn't get anywhere close to what that original joke was. And very often, I think, with certain kinds of poetry, for example, as well, you just have to depart much further from the original and not be concerned about that.
Is it permissible for a translator to improve an untidy style, for example, or even amend a flaw in the text, or should they simply reproduce it?
I think that's a really interesting question, which goes to the heart of the kind of the practical translation process, because so often in the course of a translation, you're going to be making small corrections when you find typos in your source text or something. But clearly, your question goes to something more substantial. There's a really interesting treatise on translation, the earliest treatise in English on translation from the late 18th century by an author called Alexander Fraser Tytler. And he's very sanguine about this. He basically says, oh, well, even Homer nods. So if you're translating Homer, then yeah, sure, those bits that could merit improvement, go ahead. And he has a very positive attitude to the translator and holds the translator in very high regard. Many translators, of course, translating Homer would feel, I'm not worthy.
So there has been a really interesting discussion about this in France in the last months, because they had a new translation come out of Mein Kampf, of Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And the previous translation had basically glossed over the atrocious sort of grammatical style and nonsensical bits that are in the original Hitler prose. And the original translator had produced something that was much, much more coherent. So now in the new translation, they actually stuck much more to the German text and produced this bastard French version of this bastard German text, which is much, much closer to the original, and taking away this sort of this beautification that actually happened in previous translations.
That's a really nice example. It also brings us back to the earlier point about translators interpreting, because of course there's a danger when you encounter what you think is something that needs improving in the original text. There's a danger that you've just got it wrong. And there are trends in this, and certainly I think contemporary translators are rather more inclined to assume that if there's something which eludes them, that they need to do some more homework and perhaps get more onto the wavelength of the original. And we're less inclined to think, oh, well, obviously this needs improvement.
We haven't touched on mistranslations, real errors in the text. And one of the most famous is, of course, the description of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai when his face is lit up, but translated often as Moses with a horn, which is a mistranslation, isn't it, Miriam, of Karen and Keren? And you do find images of Moses with a horn. Tell us a bit about that.
This is particularly pertinent when people take a literal view of scripture, right? When people really go down to the words to portray a particular worldview. And creationism is a good example. So people go to the Bible and say, in the beginning, although in the Bible it actually says in a beginning. So it can be one of many, many beginnings. It can be a renewal. The Bible in its language doesn't actually say this is the very beginning of time. But of course, people have taken this phrase with this specific article and then build a whole worldview around that the world is 5,700 years old. So this is a very, very good example of a mistranslation that has translated into a whole sort of ideology.
We're drawing to the end of this podcast, but I do want to ask each of you to nominate your favorite piece of translation and tell the listeners why.
I'm going to say something whimsical. My favorite translation of English into German is the dubbing of Life of Brian. So the English is hilarious, but actually the German version I find funnier. I think Life of Brian coming out in Germany has actually sort of transformed German humor to a degree. It's absolutely hilarious in German, and I think it lifted German humor to a different level. So I'm very, very grateful for the people who produced this original translation. They were absolutely geniuses.
Well, give us an example, Miriam, because many of us would have seen Life of Brian in English, but not necessarily in German.
That's actually quite difficult because I don't think I can translate the German into a sort of back into funny English.
I was thinking of a translation from French into English, and that's the translation of Georges Perec's novel La Disparition into English by Gilbert Adair as Void. The point of the novel is that it doesn't use the letter E. It's that one. People have perhaps heard of the original novel by Perec, who was one of the Oulipo group. So I mentioned translation as a kind of writing under constraints before. And of course, the Oulipo is the example par excellence of a group of writers who wanted to set themselves challenges like that. So Perec does that. He writes a quite substantial novel, a very funny novel, a very successful novel, without using the commonest letter in French, which is E. What Adair does is he does a translation which produces a very long, very funny novel in English without using the letter E. It's an extraordinary feat. And so I think it's interesting that both Miriam and I choose examples of very creative translation and very humorous translation, because there's something very endearing, I think, about both of these examples. And they're examples of kind of translation at its finest. Certainly for me, I mean, that's the kind of translation that I enjoy reading most, where, in a sense, you have to read both books. Heard a paper once at a conference in Shanghai by the Chinese translator who had just brought out the first Chinese translation of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. And that's another example, isn't it, of the kind of text which is just so challenging in itself, never mind, translating it to interpret it, to read it in the original English or whatever you want to call Joyce's language, that once you're translating it into another language, you've just got to effectively rewrite the book. And it's a fascinating process in Chinese, that's for sure.
We must end it there. So au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, arrivederci, salam, shalom. Thanks to my guests, Miriam Wagner and Duncan Large. And thanks to you too, dear listener, for listening. You know where to find us, and we'd like to hear from you. Our back catalogue of discussions, more than 80 to date, needs no translation. And have a listen to our other podcasts, such as the A to Z of the Holy Land, as well as the wonderful podcasts at Naked Scientists. I'll be back next week with some more guests.